anyone from there right now. The other co-sponsor is the Division of International Security Studies here at the Wilson Center, and no one from there right now. I should say that the International Security Studies division here is organizing their own event on Afghanistan next Monday, the 10th, which you can go to the Wilson Center website, wilsoncenter.org, to get more information about that. We're hearing a lot of bad news from Afghanistan these days. 2007 has been the deadliest year for the U.S. military since Operation Enduring Freedom began in 2001. Afghan civilian deaths have reached an all-time high of 5,700 this year, according to the Associated Press. Poppy production has reached its highest levels yet and provides an overwhelming majority of the global supply of opium. We're hearing much about tactical victories against insurgents being eclipsed by a lack of strategic success in attaining security and stability. It's not all bleak, of course. After all, Al-Qaeda has lost its former sanctuary in Afghanistan, and the Taliban no longer runs the country. Hamid Karzai continues to rule as the nation's first democratically elected president, and in many parts of the country, such as Kabul, commerce is flourishing, and children, including young women, are back in school. Measuring progress in Afghanistan over the last 6 years is difficult, particularly on a micro level. A lawyer from Kabul may give a different assessment than a woman from southern Afghanistan, such as the director of a women's center in Helmand province, who told a British newspaper several months ago that life is worse now than it was under the Taliban. If we consider recent Afghan public opinion on progress, we find that it's nuanced. On the one hand, Afghans are increasingly critical of the ability of U.S. and NATO forces to provide security, and they believe the government in Kabul doesn't care what they think. Yet, 70% of respondents in a poll released earlier this week support the U.S. military overall and want it to stay in Afghanistan. Additionally, in the same poll, 63% of Afghans say that reconstruction in their areas has been effective. Our intention today is to take a step back and to look at the broader landscape. Today's event seeks to cast a wide net, offering progress reports on a range of issues, many of them interrelated, which impact the country's security and development. And our panelists, their distinguished panelists today, will consider what victory means in Afghanistan. They'll provide assessments of the insurgency, drug production, and gender rights, and they'll identify the policies needed to address these issues moving forward. So let's get started. And you should have a sheet in front of you with biographical information on all the speakers. So for that reason, I'll be brief as I introduce each speaker before his or her presentation. So I'm going to start all the way to my right and work all the way to the left. First, we're going to hear from William Martell, an associate professor of international security studies at Tufts University's Fletcher School, and his research interests include international security, policy analysis, and strategic planning. Professor Martell's most recent publication is Victory in War, Foundations of Modern Military Policy, which was just published earlier this year. And I should say, on a personal note, I had the good fortune of having him as a professor when I was a grad student at the Fletcher School decades ago. Maybe not decades ago, years ago. And the fact that he accepted my invitation to speak today must mean that I didn't do too badly in his classes. So, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone. I was glad to see flying in from Boston today that there's snow everywhere. And having lived in Washington, I wondered how long it took to move the nation off a national alert with the snow yesterday. But it looks like it's all under control, which is kind of nice to hear. What I'm going to do is talk about this notion of victory, and I'm going to apply that specifically to the case of Afghanistan. The problem as I see it, and the reason I think this is something we all need to think about, is that there has been historically no precise language or theory about what it means to achieve victory, and yet states and policymakers have been waging war for millennia without such concepts. What victory ought to do, and as I said, I'll connect this to Afghanistan here in a very systematic way momentarily, is what victory ought to provide a sense of strategy or a vision. And it's frankly critical for all organizations, societies, and individuals to have a clear sense of what you're trying to accomplish. And I think we'll see with some degree of detail that varied quite a bit in the case of Afghanistan, frankly also with Iraq as well. So we've had, for millennia, very precise discussions about how to configure military organizations and national policy, all to deal with the concept of what we're trying to achieve in war. And there's been volumes written since in the last several thousand years about what it means to how states should conduct war and for what purposes. But as I said, there is no systematic framework to describe all of these ideas, and it's something that I've been tackling, and I think it's something that's very much worth thinking about. Now, this brings us to Afghanistan. There are several critical, and I underline the word nonpartisan kinds of questions, both for policymakers in a political and a military sense, about what we are trying to achieve in Afghanistan, what we have achieved, and frankly, what remains to be achieved in the future. Specific questions that I'd like to tackle for a few minutes today is how do we define victory in Afghanistan? And by that question, you may assume that in some senses, we have achieved victories or successes in Afghanistan. Second, has it and can it be attained? And I will argue yes in various ways, but in a more systematic sense. And frankly, are we able to measure what it means to achieve victory in Afghanistan? So I'd like to talk about several kinds of things, and Michael had mentioned to you, I guess when we're all finished, we'll all, of course, be delighted to take questions or comments or barbs or whatever. I'd like to focus on this notion of a framework for victory, how to define it very briefly, and then apply that to the question of Afghanistan, looking specifically at U.S. objectives, how we might interpret victory, broad conclusions and observations about those ideas, and then frankly wrap up with a series of questions about the implications. Problem with victory is, and particularly in the last handful of years since 2001, there has been a divisive, discordant debate within American society about not only Afghanistan and Iraq, but frankly a whole range of issues in foreign policy. And I frankly view that as a very destructive development. There have been as well very confused debates about what it means to achieve victory. In Afghanistan, is it building democracy? In Iraq, is it building democracy? Is it transforming the world? We have debates about what it means to achieve victory or success in the global war on terror. And, of course, in the daily news, we have questions about Iran and North Korea and their nuclear programs and, again, what that means for us. So the question that I think policymakers and the public need to confront specifically with respect to victory is what does it mean, and more specifically, what have we signed up for when the state proceeds to engage in military operations or war? Victory has been historically used as fundamentally as a synonym for something good happened here, either immediately or looking back retrospectively. It ought to define, and in some senses it does, define the state's goals and strategies, and strategy. And this is the foundation of what one ought to think about with respect to victory. Now, victory requires more systematic thinking than that. It should ask you what actions are required once we have defined victory, and you'll see in a moment that I define this very differently. Second, what information do policymakers and the public need when they're involved in making decisions about intervention, and what costs are involved, both human, political, economic, and social costs. We have seen, and I can regale you at length about this, we have seen that the term victory is used in the most casual sense in, frankly, American and other societies. My challenge to people is pick up any major newspaper and you will find the word victory used to describe something successful in the domains of politics, economics, sports, and the rest. We need much more systematic ideas about victory, and we desperately need them at this point. So the framework that I've established, and I'm going to take this, just outline it briefly, and then apply it specifically to Afghanistan. First, what I define as level of victory in war, and I define 3 levels, and again, I'll specifically demonstrate how this connects with Afghanistan. First, what I describe as tactical victory. Those are short-term successes, maybe on the battlefield, but narrow, tactically defined, short-term kinds of successes in a battle or in other engagements. The second level is political military. I'd note as well, all other forms of victory build upon tactical victories. Some, however, never translate into greater than tactical victories. The second level is what I call political military victory. There's a bit of a food fight you can get into with scholars about whether the political goal is the highest or whether it's a strategic goal. You'll see how I voted here momentarily. Political military victories define the state achieving some fraction, not all, of its broad political and military goals, which again I'll specify in a moment. And those are common beyond words in the history, looking at the history of military affairs and strategy and the like. The final kind of victory, and it's the special category, I would argue Americans have a special predilection to liking this third kind of victory, and it's what I call grand strategic victory. And if I asked you the example of a grand strategic victory, odds are you'd either say the Second World War or perhaps the Cold War. But that is the distinguishing feature between tactical victories and political military victories on the one hand, and grand strategic victories is grand strategic victories ultimately reorder the international system, and that's why I use the examples of the Second World War and the Cold War. The second dimension of this framework is what I call change in the status quo. And that is whether we're envisioning a limited change or no change in the current conditions as we confront them, or comprehensive changes in the status quo. Third, what I call scale of mobilization. It is both military forces, it's economics, it's resources devoted, it's defense production. It may be public opinion and public support. And again, that ranges from the lesser to the greater scale. The final one, and the one I think that I find the most interesting among these, is what I call post-conflict obligations. And again, they range on that scale from some to a lot. And it's the extent to which the victor accepts, in a public sense or a functional sense, a responsibility for the conditions prevailing in the society that it has defeated, or the state it has defeated. Now let's apply that a little more. Now, a couple examples. The best example in recent history of a political military victory is the 1991 Persian Gulf War. We achieved some broad set of political military objectives. We did not redefine events in that part of the world. There is, of course, a certain allure with grand strategic victories. As you'll see, while the words weren't used, the language crept ever so obviously and evidently into the language about the case of Afghanistan. Now let's talk about Afghanistan. And again, you'll find the essence of this framework is to force both policymakers and scholars and broad publics to be much more precise in describing what it is they're trying to achieve or have achieved. Tactical victory. We achieved a series of tactical victories in Afghanistan, beginning with the invasion that occurred in October of the military operations that began in 2001 in October and continued into the winter as the Taliban and the regime began to collapse. Second, we also achieved, in some senses, political military victories in Afghanistan. We defeated the Taliban government. We defeated the military. We helped dismantle the economic system within Afghanistan. We chased al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan. Now, here's the danger, if you will, of looking at victory in these terms, and particularly what I call the allure of grand strategic victory. We also, and I'll go through in some detail on the language used by American policymakers to demonstrate that while they weren't using the term grand strategic victory, they were clearly thinking in these terms. When one thinks in terms of grand strategic victory, in addition to dismantling societies, you now accept responsibility for beginning to rebuild elements of that society, rebuild the government, rebuild the economy, reorganize the military. If I look at the example of Germany and Japan in the Second World War, reorient their foreign policy, build close relationships and alliances, and fundamentally change the international system. So look at the case of Afghanistan. As a result of the invasion, Afghanistan has a democratically elected government. It has, and we can argue about this despite recent events, it has been moving toward greater stability while we see lots of signs of insurgency. And again, I know Seth will be talking about that at some length. We also see a potential hope, again, looking at the language used by American policymakers, that they were hopeful in the case of Afghanistan to reorder, at least initially, this part of the world on the basis of establishing a democratic form of government. Now, if you look back at the particular case of Afghanistan, you do see a clear attempt and desire on the part of American policymakers to use this victory, spurred, of course, by all the language you've written with respect to 9/11, spurred by aiming toward the notion of changing the international system by building a democratic state in Afghanistan. I would note as well that a year and a half later, that language was very clear with respect to Iraq as well, which is a matter for another day. Now let's look specifically at U.S. objectives in Afghanistan. First was, and again, this is the policy statements that were published by the White House, by the Defense Department, by others. First was to destroy al-Qaeda and the Taliban regime, quote, to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime. We also sought to demonstrate that the Taliban could no longer harbor terrorists given the risk of war that posed. And we also argued that the Taliban, again in language reminiscent of higher levels of victory, that the Taliban and support for al-Qaeda represented a transcendent threat to American interests. We therefore sought to destroy the foundations of the Taliban's power. Once we're moving beyond tactical victory or tactical successes in battle, once we start talking about the elements I'm describing here, you see very clearly that we're moving toward higher levels of victory. We had de facto regime change within Afghanistan. We supported anti-Taliban resistance movements. We helped set up an interim democratic government run by Afghanis. And we established the foundations of what many remain hopeful as a long-term democratic experiment within Afghanistan. second objective that defined American policy with respect to Iraq, to Afghanistan, and of course with respect to victory, is to demonstrate a will on the part of the United States that we would eradicate the sources of terrorism. I quote President Bush directly on this. We will pursue nations that provide aid to safe haven to terrorism. Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you're with us or you're against or with the terrorists. From this day forward, any nation that continues to harbor or support terrorism, we regard it as the United States as a hostile regime. Second, the United States sought to demonstrate that it has the will to eradicate the sources of terrorism. Now, the language becomes more interesting. Bush said this war will not be like the war against Iraq a decade ago, which I argue, this is not his words, which I argue was a lesser form of victory, with its decisive liberation of territory and its swift conclusion. It will not look like the air war above Kosovo 2 years ago, where no ground troops were used and not a single American was lost in combat. Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, counseled caution to anyone who thinks a military victory in Afghanistan will be swift or easy. To accomplish this, as you all know, the Secretary of Defense ordered General Franks in late September of 2001 to develop credible military options for dealing with Afghanistan, and the specific guidance, as articulated by the President, was to destroy the al-Qaeda network inside Afghanistan, along with the illegitimate Taliban regime, which was harboring and protecting terrorists. So when we're talking, and I'll come back at the end of my remarks, the notion of regime change, when you're talking about regime change, you are talking about very high levels of victory, which imposes very high levels of commitment on the part of a society. The U.S. commitment at this point, in terms of objectives, was to rebuild Afghanistan. Those words are very important, to rebuild Afghanistan in terms of a post-Taliban reconstruction to stabilize the country, that is, to remake this country after the Taliban regime was destroyed, and not to occupy the country, and I know you're aware of those words and those of the language. Now let me talk a little bit about how we might interpret these kinds of observations about Afghanistan, its implications for how we think about victory, dare I use the word success in foreign policy endeavors. When we think about the hierarchy of objectives, the first was, of course, to remove the Taliban regime, which I noted. To do that, we were seeking to implement a policy of political change that would lead to rebuilding of the government, restoring civil authority. We were going to work, as we did with the United Nations, to create a post-Taliban government within Afghanistan. And we saw a regime change as a tool for eradicating both the Taliban and al-Qaeda. And we saw it as well at this level of victory to demonstrate that we were committed to destroying regimes that were involved in terrorism one way or the other. Second, I think what has hobbled American policy, despite the various successes and problems that others will talk about with respect to Afghanistan, is that we need to define precisely what we mean by victory and to adhere to that strategy to accomplish that objective. Now, in some senses, Afghanistan can be a model for how a state organizes itself, in this case the United States, to achieve victory. And the concept of victory that was articulated by the President and by his senior political and military advisors provided clear overall guidance for the conduct of the war. The language of the President is on a higher level, if you will, of thinking about victory. We will win this war, he said, by the patient accumulation of successes. Rumsfeld said that we will deal with terrorism as acts of war, not as acts of crime or as legal problems. And that the state would respond, again, this language is important, with all tools of national power. States don't use that language unless they're awfully serious about what it is they're trying to accomplish. And when I hear that language, it suggests to me that the state is thinking at very high levels of victory. Third, I would argue that at least for now, the outcome of events within Afghanistan has been at least consistent with what could nominally be described as a political military victory. When one thinks in terms of the destruction of the regime and the events that have transpired since late 2001 and early 2002. But the broad policy intent was far more than that. The broad policy intent by the U.S. administration, was in fact to achieve a internationally reordering victory within Afghanistan, and to use the events of 9/11 or to respond to the events of 9/11 as a way to respond to that problem and to achieve victory on a very high level. I would submit to you that from the beginning, though the language was not clearly used, what the Bush administration sought to achieve in Afghanistan was grand strategic victory. And really, their language left no room for other interpretations. Now, the reason I mention this and the reason it's important is when one makes those declarations about policy, it establishes very high levels of commitment and a certain sense of establishes the credibility of the state that one has to continue to match. I quote a couple of examples from Bush using this pretty grandiose language about victory in Afghanistan. Now that the war has been declared on us, we will lead the world to victory. I'm reminded of the language that FDR used on December 8th, 1941, where he talked about change in the international system to defeat the sources of tyranny that had attacked the United States. He said the war will not be short, and the course to victory will be long. He also said the United States will do whatever it takes to accomplish victory to win this war. Now, the problem is that much of the discussion about victory does not fit into these neat models or analogies of history. And in a sense, yes, I clearly see that I'm on the end of my remarks. So, specific conclusions about the case of Afghanistan. One, the level of victory operated at least on a political military level, but we were seeking to reorder the international system, and that fits into the category of strategic level victories. Second, we sought and arguably achieved with the Afghanis a comprehensive change in the status quo. We changed the nature of the society within Afghanistan in a fundamental way, including removing the government, including displacing al-Qaeda, destroying the regime, and politically demonstrating responses on the part of the United States. Second, the level of mobilization the United States engaged in was actually quite limited. Really, this was an off-the-shelf or come-as-you-are kind of war rather than one involving great levels of preparation. And one can look in terms of actual resources consumed, in terms of time to respond, time to marshal the requisite forces, was all very limited, very nominal. And you can also look at very high levels of public support that were mobilized to be supportive of the war. Last, when one looks in terms of post-conflict obligations for Afghanistan, these were protracted on the most significant sense of the word. Large-scale program for rebuilding the political, social, and economic foundations of Afghanistan. We promised lots of money. We overthrew the Taliban regime, and by doing so, establish an obligation to the international system that we would have significant post-conflict obligations. And our policy intent from the beginning was to create a democratically elected government within Afghanistan. My final comments. The policy intent undeniably was victory on a strategic level on the part of the United States. The question now that we have to think about is how much is Afghanistan an exemplar of future wars that we may consider? And I guess the broader question is, when we think now about the nature of the challenges that are faced internationally, how well does this framework apply to the case of non-state actors and the ability to achieve victory against these kinds of actors? I'll come back to these remarks in the conclusion. But I will note that one clear way to measure the level of victory, particularly to understand the extent to which the state has high levels of seeks to achieve a high level of victory, is the discussion about regime change. When you hear that language, when I hear that language, I know, frankly, that means one practical way to measure the end of a war is through regime change. A second, and you hear this in the language as well, is to eradicate the sources that lead to radicalism within societies. So I would conclude by noting, and again with Michael's missive clearly visible on my left, Afghanistan for now the United States and Afghanistan have achieved a political military victory. They have achieved some of their political and military goals, but the broad intent is a regime reorienting, internationally reorienting war. Now, there are factors that undermine this. I know Seth will talk about this, of course, but the insurgency fits in one example. Some of the lack of accomplishments on the part of the President Karzai. So, my last couple of comments: it is essential, whether it's Afghanistan or elsewhere, policymakers need to establish clearly, directly, unequivocally from the beginning what precisely they seek to achieve in war. And if I look at the example of the United States in the case of Afghanistan, it's clear that this country used very precise language about grand strategic victory, but really never measured that or matched that in terms of the actions required. So we fought it in a sense with strategic level objectives and probably political military levels of resources. And I would submit to you that it's critical that we have that agreement that we have agreement in a society about what we're trying to accomplish. The language used in the United States at the beginning of the Second World War is an exemplar in that regard. Everyone clearly knew what the agenda was. Final comments. First, with respect to Afghanistan or more broadly other kinds of problems we may confront, do not let others define victory for you. It is essential that you do so clearly and succinctly. Second, do not let events dictate the strategy. Do not become responsive in dealing with these kinds of problems. And if policymakers ignore this advice, as they're wont to do, then what you tend to see is confusion, withdrawal, disengagement, and emotional exhaustion, all of which I think are pretty good descriptors of American society today. Now, in the end, I remain an optimist, and I think that eventually societies will do the right thing, and I draw certain solace from Winston Churchill, who said that eventually the Americans do the right thing because they exhaust all other options. So my intent was to get people thinking systematically about what victory means in the case of Afghanistan as a way to understand what commitments we have made and how we ought to proceed as we look downstream. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Martell. We're next going to hear from Seth Jones, who is a political scientist with the RAND Corporation and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. At RAND, his recent work is focused on the state of the insurgency and counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, which is exactly what we're going to hear about now. He has traveled throughout most of the country in the last few years, meeting with a variety of people, and he's now currently finishing a book on the rise of Afghanistan's insurgency after the Taliban's ouster in 2001.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I wanted to begin, actually, by giving you a quote. I'll read it first and then provide the context. Death by 1,000 cuts. This is the time-honored tactic of the guerrilla army against a large conventional force. In Afghanistan, it is the only way to defeat a superpower on the battlefield with ill-trained, ill-disciplined, and ill-equipped tribesmen whose only asset is an unconquerable fighting spirit welded to a warrior tradition. Ambushes, assassinations, attacks on supply convoys, bridges, pipelines, and airfields, with the avoidance of set-piece battles, these are history's proven techniques for the guerrilla, especially in Afghanistan. The quote, interestingly enough, comes from, for those who haven't read it, Brigadier Mohammad Yusuf's account of the Soviet wars in the 1980s. He was the head of ISI's, Pakistani intelligence's, Afghanistan Bureau, in charge of coordinating strategy with the 7 major Afghan Mujahideen commanders. As I will note, the situations are in many ways different, but I would say they may be not as dissimilar as some people might think. What I'm going to do here is ask a couple of questions and then provide at least over the next 16 minutes or so brief answers. First, I'm going to ask where things stand at this point. What is the general state of the insurgency? Second, as part of that, I'm going to look at how successful counterinsurgency efforts have been. How successful counterinsurgency efforts have been. Is this better? You want me to start all over again? Just kidding. Just kidding. First, I'm going to look at then where we stand at this point. What is the state of the insurgency? Second, how successful have counterinsurgency efforts been? And as part of that, actually, can the insurgency be won? And I'm going to ground this in really a lot of this comes from on the ground, traveling through, especially the east, the south, and most recently some of the central provinces of Afghanistan, most recently about 4 weeks ago in northern Kandahar and Helmand provinces. And as we heard earlier, this is coming in a lot of this is coming out of a book I have done, or am finishing up on the rise of the insurgency. It's interviewed pretty much all of the major Afghan, Pakistani, American officials involved since then, military commanders, intelligence, etc. So where do things stand at this point? Well, I'm not particularly optimistic in a number of ways, but let me first preface my remarks by saying, look, I'm going to focus mostly on security. There clearly are other areas of the country that one could be more optimistic about. The economy, for example, according to bank data, grew by an estimated 14% in 2005, about 5.3% in 2006. Annual end-period inflation is fairly low, 4.8% in Kabul, 3.9% nationally, which is really Kabul and a couple of other major cities. There, of course, have been democratic elections. And President Karzai's approval ratings, at least according to the most recent ABC News BBC poll, was about at 63%, which I think a number of Western leaders would probably crave for those public opinion polls. So not all is bad. On the security front, which is what I'm mostly going to focus on, though, I think the picture is not particularly bright. And I'm going to reference the map, which in my view is sort of a very preliminary, take this with a grain of salt, assessment of what the insurgency looks like today. The big yellow area is area where there has been infiltration, particularly by Taliban, by the Taliban. I'm going to go through the major groups, at least as I see them, because this is obviously not a Taliban insurgency. There are multiple actors involved. And what's new and interesting, I think, in this sense, are three things. One is there has been a movement over the last year or two or three into the west, including into southern Herat province, Shindan, the NATO, the Italians, and a number of other countries are reporting increasing levels of Taliban infiltration. And second, into the center. About 9 months ago, I could travel by ground from Kabul, about 2 hours west, to Wardak province. My last trip a few weeks ago, it was too dangerous. There were Taliban, some probably criminal and other allied checkpoints along the road, and this was too dangerous even ground travel. People have done it, but it's very dangerous, especially for Westerners or sort of Western-looking Afghans. So, and this is again 2 hours. This trip for me was supposed to be just 2 hours west of the capital. And then third is what we see here is the fact that this is really, we talk here about Afghanistan. When you talk about the insurgency, it obviously it's a Pakistani-Afghan insurgency. And as I'll get to with most of the major groups, virtually all serious insurgent groups operating on this front, the border is absolutely fundamental. Most have their command and control networks. I don't want to use that phrase too strongly because I would say most of the Taliban operations and other operations I've seen are fairly decentralized. But to the degree that there's a command and control structure, a large chunk of that is across the border in places like Quetta, Pakistan. For the Taliban, it's also on the media and propaganda efforts in Peshawar, on the financial front in Karachi. When you get into the Haqqani network, you're talking about North Waziristan, Miram Shah, Mir Ali. For the al-Qaeda and foreign fighters, the Uzbeks and others, you're talking also about places like North Waziristan and then up into the Bajur area of the tribal areas. Hezb Islami, also major presence on both sides of the borders. So what you see here then is Taliban penetration in a number of areas. You also see al-Qaeda, Hezb Islami, and the Haqqani network operating on both sides of the border. And in addition to that, you also have a number of local sub-tribes and tribal groups cooperating with these range of actors, as well as criminal organizations, especially in places like Helmand. Very competent, well-equipped with RPGs, drug trafficking organizations. And so what we've seen, if I can just sort of quickly do a snapshot of 2001 through 2007, is a mass exodus beginning at the end of 2001 of al-Qaeda operatives into Pakistan, and Taliban from Kandahar and other areas into Pakistan as well. There were some efforts by the U.S. government and the Pakistanis to conduct operations in Pakistan, although they were predominantly al-Qaeda operatives and other foreign fighters, not Afghan or Pakistani Taliban. In fact, there was deep reluctance among those the CIA station chief that was there at the time that I've interviewed to do anything about anybody other than al-Qaeda. So what you had over the next couple of years, really in 2002 and 2003 and 2004, is the beginnings of a rejuvenation. They were able to rebuild across the border, rearm, create what's often called the neo-Taliban, recruit at a variety of places. And then by 2005, and especially 2006, began to conduct what are quite seriously sustained operations in what is now about half the country. As the NATO commander of RC South said to me a couple of weeks ago, he said, NATO and Afghan forces meaning mostly Army, police to the degree that they exist, and Afghan National Auxiliary Police, who sort of exist depending on the time of day and the province you're talking about, control at most 20% of the South, which is most of your southern provinces. The rest are controlled to the degree that's a useful term by a combination of sub-state actors and Taliban. So 80% of your South is non-Afghan, non-NATO, non-Afghan government, non-NATO forces. So, and this has really been the heartland of the insurgency. So I would say, so what you've seen then is also increases in the numbers of improvised explosive devices, suicide attacks. 2007 are all at highs since the overthrow of the Taliban regime. So I would argue where we stand today is you've got multiple groups operating. They've pushed into greater areas of the country, and they're able to conduct greater numbers of attacks. It's led to more deaths. Now, just to put an important caveat here, no group is capable of really taking any major city. I mean, the strategy at the moment is primarily focusing on rural areas, not unlike the Mujahideen commanders did during the Soviet wars. And it's probably I mean, if I were to devise a strategy, that's probably the one I would do as well. Not that I'm giving advice to the Taliban, but that's basically the focus. So, the Taliban did try in the end of last summer and early fall of 2006 to what really was an effort to sort of take Kandahar city, and the Canadians, the Americans, the Dutch, and a number of other countries during Operation Medusa really pushed them back. So it was, among other things, it was a clear example that the Taliban's real success has been in moving in the rural areas of the country, not in trying to take urban areas. So that then gets us to sort of counterinsurgency efforts so far. And my argument really builds on a lot of the literature on civil wars and insurgencies, which has come out of individuals like Jim Fearon and David Layton, who are now at Stanford. It's a whole literature on Stathis Kalivas at Yale. And I want to point to two key variables. One is governance. Second is outside support. Both have been, I think, fundamental to the rise of the insurgency in Afghanistan. And I think both will be fundamental in, if we can do it, turning a corner. And I'll start with governance. If you look historically at insurgencies since 1945, one of the things that has been certainly true is the collapse of governance has been a critical precondition for the rise of insurgencies. That is, governments are unable to establish law and order in key parts of the country, and they're also have difficulties in distributing essential services. And what we've seen, I would argue, key factor since 2001, and really over the last few years, is something of a collapse of governance in Afghanistan, to the degree that you can call it a collapse. but very serious difficulties on two fronts. One is the ability to establish law and order in rural areas of the country. This is primarily a function of police forces. The state of the Afghan National Police is hard to disparage too much because they really are fairly corrupt, ill-trained, ill-equipped, and not particularly loyal to anyone other than perhaps local commanders. There have been numerous reports. I was on a convoy that got attacked by a Taliban Afghan National Police mission in Kandahar a couple of weeks ago. These are police forces that were colluding at various points with insurgent groups. So that gives you a general sense of what the state of the police is. The problem, and the reason I think this has contributed to difficulties and challenges, is Afghan villages aren't being protected in key areas of the south, in particular, part of the west, the center, and some areas of the east. The east has been seen, I would say, some improvements. But the Afghan government has not protected in any serious, sustained way local villages. So in some cases, it's actually, if you're a local villager in Kandahar or Helmand, you generally have no choice but to provide at least tacit support for Taliban forces operating or allied forces operating in your area, because if not, you'll get a bullet in the head and you'll be dragged behind a car in the middle of the village. So I think most of us in that sort of case would choose life as opposed to death, and so but that's the sort of situation you found yourself to some degree in. Also, on the other side of governance, essential services, again, very serious challenges at the lower levels, district level, village level, in providing key targeted services, electricity and water. These things keep coming up in public opinion polls to local villages. What you have now, as the Asia Foundation polls and other polls have indicated, is there is an increasing perception that 6 years after the overthrow of the Taliban regime, life is really no better for most sort of local, rural Afghans than it was, again, 6 years ago. And so what that means is support levels for the Taliban actually aren't high. It's just support levels for the government have gone down. So in a sense, it's not that the Taliban is getting lots of support, it's the government is losing it. And the second part of this issue, I talked about governance first, is outside support. And this works both ways. Outside support is a double-edged sword here, as I noted earlier. And what this means on the Afghan context is two things. One is levels of support from the international community on a per capita level in terms of numbers of forces and financial assistance have been among the lowest of any nation state-building operation since 1945. Part of that is, this was deliberate. In 2001, if you go back to Bonn, this was part of the light footprint approach. This was a decision that was made out of Bonn. I've gone back and interviewed the key decision makers of the Pentagon, State, National Security Council. End of February, for example, I'll give you one highlight. There is debates within the National Security Council on a peacekeeping force in Afghanistan. State Department, this is mostly Colin Powell and Armitage, supported a peacekeeping force outside of Kabul. The Chief State Department envoy at the time, Jim Dobbins, also supported it. UN, Lakhdar Brahimi, who had negotiated a bond, supported it. The Pentagon was not supportive of it for a number of reasons. So the final decision at the NSC at the end of February in 2002 was not to put a peacekeeping force outside of Kabul. So what you had is limited ISAF force in Kabul, some special operations forces at the time in the east that were mostly conducting counter-terrorist operations. And you had very low levels of U.S. and other NATO resources on the ground on a per capita level. And then, of course, by November of 2001, you had planning beginning at the end of November, planning beginning for Iraq. So I interviewed the chief targeter for Tommy Frank's CENTCOM staff in Tampa. They were pulling targeters off of Afghanistan in November of 2001 to conduct planning down in Tampa for the Iraq front. And, of course, this also triggered a pullout of CIA resources out of the Pakistani-Afghan front, predators that were coming off the line, moving towards the Iraqi front. So Afghanistan really, even at the end of 2001, began to take a back seat on the U.S. side to the U.S. interest in Iraq. And so that light footprint approach had an impact on what was done and the resources devoted to Afghanistan. The other side of this outside support, of course, as you see with the border here, is that there was a sanctuary that developed for virtually all major insurgent groups on the Pakistani side. And of course, now we've had the National Intelligence Estimate a couple of months ago finally come out and say this. But this has been true for a while. There are also lots of indications of Frontier Corps and some low and mid-level ISI support for insurgent groups on Pakistani territory as well. So, again, what's been the reason for this rise? I would actually argue two things: governance and outside support. On the outside support front, essentially, I think too little on the international side, too much on the support for insurgents, including, of course, the international jihadi connection. So that's probably the major explanation for why you've gotten a rise. And then, of course, can the insurgency be won, which is where I end on. I think these issues need to be addressed. We'll hear about drugs in a second, so I'll leave the whole drug issue aside. But I think we're talking about two things. We're talking about governance, and we're talking about outside support. These will be fundamental. Will the Afghan government be able to effectively establish law and order in rural areas of the country, especially where it matters most in areas like the South, which is the center of gravity for the Taliban and most of the groups? This is a particular focus on your police forces. And this means, especially on the mentoring side, major efforts to improve the state of the police and the key provision of essential services. And also, as part of this is an important part of governance, as part of the bank's definition of governance, is dealing with corruption. And I don't want to get too much into this drug issue, but there is not a lot. There's not a lack of information on individuals, including in the government, the Afghan government, involved in narcotics trafficking and other forms of corruption. The justice system, for the most part, has not taken any serious action. I mean, I would ask if somebody can answer this question for me. I would appreciate it. High-level drug traffickers or government officials who have been tried, prosecuted, and thrown in jail for involvement in corruption. I am not aware of any inside Afghanistan. This is a problem because the public opinion polls now, including the one of the more recent Asia Foundation polls, show extraordinarily high levels of concern for corruption in the government. Stuff like this needs to be addressed. Also, on the outside support issue, one of the major NATO debates is throwing resources, among other places, into the South. Canadians have done a Herculean effort in the South, but they cannot hold territory. They try and clear areas like Panjwai district. They cannot hold it. They do not have resources to hold territory. That presents a big problem. And on the other issue, on outside actors, and I'll end on this note, I think when you talk about Pakistan, you're really talking about a regional approach to dealing with Afghanistan. Go back to the Bonn process in 2001. On the U.S. side, the key negotiators were Jim Dobbins, who was the envoy, and really his sidekick at the time was Zalmay Khalilzad, now the U.S. ambassador in New York. As part of Bonn, they had senior representatives of the Indian government, the Pakistani government, the Iranian government, the Russian government, and other Western countries. We have somehow, since that time, lost that regional approach to dealing with Afghanistan. That is, bringing together key countries in the region, the Iranians, the Pakistanis, the Indians, because addressing Afghanistan, as anybody who's looked at the issue over the last several decades understands, Neighbors matter an enormous amount in this area of the world, in Afghanistan. If you do not bring them on board, they will meddle. So I wanted to end on one sort of one comment that a friend of mine in Afghanistan gave me. He said he was in downtown Kabul a couple of months ago, and there was an American walking around. This local Afghan comes up to him and says, "You're obviously a Western, maybe an American. What are you doing in Afghanistan?" He says, "Well, I'm actually writing a book. I'm writing a book on Afghanistan." He said, "Oh, that's great. That's wonderful. We need good books on Afghanistan. We see you've written lots on Iraq, but very few on Afghanistan. So how long have you been here?" He said, "Well, I actually got here yesterday." "Oh, you got here yesterday. So obviously you're going to be around for a long time." He said, "No, I'm actually leaving tomorrow." He said, "Well, how are you going to write a book if you've been here for 2 or 3 days?" "Well, that's actually the title of the book. It's Afghanistan yesterday, today, and tomorrow." The moral of the story, of course, is we have a reputation in this area of the world of not staying to finish the job. So, and locals remember that. So I hope in this case that reputation, we at least can change it, because based on the way the situation is today, I think we need to be focusing on a number of key issues so that we can reverse the trend.
Thank you very much. Our third speaker is William Bird, an economist and an advisor with the Poverty Reduction and Economic Management Unit of the World Bank's South Asia region. His recent publications include a report done by the UN and the World Bank, which is called Afghanistan's Drug Industry: Structure, Functioning, Dynamics, and Implications for Counter-Narcotics Policy.
Thank you. I'm actually a development economist, and excuse my voice. In the last 2 days, I've gone from summer in South Africa to winter here, but hopefully it will recover over time. Well, I have a job which is very easy in some respects and very difficult in others. The easy part is to give you some thoughts about how to measure progress against drugs. And even easier is assessing progress, as I'll show you. And it's also fairly easy to define what would constitute success, especially in the longer run. The more difficult part then becomes how to achieve that success. And if I'm lucky, the moderator will tell me I've run out of time before I get to that part. But let me start off with a few points. I mean, the easy part is that counter-narcotics policies have failed, and the report that was referred to was very clearly, and in fact our press, the World Bank and UNODC press release, which accompanied that report when it was published, said that counter-narcotics policies had failed, and it's almost a no-brainer. But let me go through that a little bit more and cover some of the indicators of progress that you might look at. One is the area of land that's under opium poppy cultivation. That's a fairly reliable figure. Both the US and UNODC make estimates of it, and it certainly provides an indication of what level the Afghan rural economy is engaged in opium production. So reducing that would be a sign of success. Data which is less reliable because you have to estimate yields, which is more difficult, is the total opium production. Now, these different indicators may also relate to what your objective is. I would argue that if you're looking at the economic dependence of the Afghan economy on opium, the area of opium cultivation or the income from opium is probably a reasonable measure. If you're looking at some kind of global impact of Afghanistan's opium production and what the harms it is doing internationally, then the amount of opium, opiates, heroin, etc., that go out into the world market is a relevant measure. Another area which is interesting is the total value of opium production and its share in GDP. And I would argue that this gets or begins to get at some of the issue that Seth was raising about the drug-related corruption. In other words, the total amounts of money involved. Now, interesting, in the public discourse, there are a lot of, and this not only in Afghanistan, but other countries like Colombia. I mean, the amount of area of poppy fields eradicated, I argue, is not a relevant measure of progress. It's a measure of input. It's not a measure of outcomes. The amount of poppy fields eradicated in Afghanistan by confirmed estimates has, I think, tripled or maybe more than tripled over the last 4 years, during which time total production after subtracting those eradicated fields has sharply increased to enormous levels. So clearly, eradication or information about numbers of seizures and arrests, et cetera, all of that is measuring some inputs, but it's not really measuring success. Now, the easiest part of my my presentation is that simply it doesn't really matter what measure you use currently in Afghanistan. The drug policies have failed. Whether you look at any of these, clearly, with a partial exception of the share of GDP, because the legal economy or illicit economy has been growing very fast too. So the share of the opium economy in total GDP has not been going up. In fact, except for the last year, it has been declining. But other than that, all of the indicators point you to failure. So, and the qualitative research findings, both in the report that we did, but elsewhere as well, suggesting that the drug industry is consolidating around fewer politically powerful and connected actors, further supports this assessment that they failed. Now, what would constitute success? I'm actually following the TORs that were given rather closely and maybe a bit mechanically. But in the short run, I think it is very dangerous to certainly to claim victory or to even claim success. And maybe this is a difference from the military perspective at one point, because actual tactical success can actually mean failure in the future. And the best example, I would argue, of this is the Taliban's own ban, where they successfully, virtually completely got rid of opium production and cultivation in their own territory in 2000, 2001, but it set the seeds for its own failure through opium-related debt, which multiplied because the farmers who were no longer growing opium, their debts did not go away. They were actually increased because the effective interest rate is over 100%. So you find many farmers, even now some, but many for many years were struggling with that debt from the Taliban ban. I'd also argue, this is just an aside, is that the Taliban ban may have undermined the Taliban politically and may in part explain the rather unexpectedly easy victory over the Taliban in 2001. I won't take that too far, but certainly some observers have suggested that. In the core drug-producing areas were the core areas of Taliban support, and their ban certainly made them less popular with rural households, with farmers, et cetera, in those areas. So short term, got to be careful. And sorry, I mean, if Congress or the World Bank Board of Directors says what happened this year, we can't claim success, and we shouldn't claim failure either. Long run, I think it's also, there's a fairly clear measure, and it's the total area of opium cultivation in the country. And if that is going down over the long run, that can be defined rather credibly and sustainably as success. Now, long run means at least 5 or maybe 10-year moving averages. You need to devise an index of that kind of thing, which is moving average, so you get rid of any overemphasis on a single year. It's possible, although I'm not privy to the latest information, that 2008 may show a decline in opium production, and that should not be seen as a sign of success. It may be more like a market correction to the overproduction in 2007. That's just a small example. But if you're looking at over a 5 or 10-year horizon, then the moving average of opium poppy cultivation should go down. Am I running out of time? Because I'm beginning to get to more difficult parts of my presentation. But I've got to speak more slowly. Let's see. Well, okay. it's also easier, and I think economists love doing this. It's easier to say what's not going to work in Afghanistan. So I'll delay the inevitable by spending a little bit of time on that. And all this is in publicly available material that we've produced or that I've presented at various places. But clearly, a lot of these solutions, which are seen particularly as one-dimensional solutions, i.e. one nice, attractive idea that will solve the problem, these really don't stand up to scrutiny. One example is blanket eradication, and especially aerial spraying. On the blanket eradication side, the Taliban ban was unsustainable, which is one major example of it. The impact on the local economy means that actually sharp reductions in a single year in areas and affecting people that are dependent on opium to make ends meet are actually going to worsen the problem, because those people then go through distress sales of assets, of daughters, whatever, and they are actually more dependent. The only way they can get out of their situation becomes opium. So it is possible to do some targeted efforts at better off areas which are producing opium, and certainly the core areas in Helmand are rather rich agricultural areas that could produce other things. In Nangarhar province around Jalalabad and some of these other areas with good irrigation and water and land and access to markets. Those areas, opium reduction can actually be, translate into people moving into other livelihoods on a sustainable basis. In the majority of areas, no. So you could target eradication efforts at new areas, at better off areas. These are not dependent on opium, and you could achieve some sustainable results. At the opposite extreme, it's sometimes suggested to legalize or license opium production in Afghanistan, including for medicinal purposes. This measure also, however attractive superficially, really doesn't hold up to scrutiny, and partly it's just because of the same governance and law and order problems that were already referred to, is what would stop Afghans who are currently producing 93% of about, or maybe more, of the world illicit world opium production on less than 10% of the good land from simply doubling production. So they'll be happy to take up the licensed production, and the illegal production will merrily continue. There's no reason why that couldn't happen in the current situation. I mean, basically, one point is if you had the governance and law and order system that you could run a license system in rural areas, you would also have the capability to ban it. So sorry, I hate to shoot down attractive ideas. Another idea is, and God forbid it was even mentioned as being in line with the European Union CAP agriculture subsidy program, to subsidize other crops. And when you again remember that opium it's very footloose. It's grown on very small part of Afghan territory, and they're already the predominant world producer. So if you wanted to actually subsidize farmers so that they would not grow opium, you'd have to subsidize all of them, not just the current opium producers, because otherwise somebody else would start producing it. You just shift it. You wouldn't reduce it. And that starts getting very costly. And let's not forget their porous borders. Actually, wheat production is not the crop of Afghanistan's future. So, I mean, I'm in favor of some targeted efforts to support horticulture, high-value exports, et cetera. But blanket subsidies just will not work, and they will become very unaffordable. I forgot to mention on the licensing proposal, there's another problem. Even if the governance and law and order problems were somehow solved, is that the existing international producers of legal opium, Australia biggest in the world, France I think second, India, Turkey, and now the UK is producing legal opium. These people are not going to open up markets. It's a classic agriculture subsidy type of issue, which the World Bank has for a long time been speaking against. Developed countries' subsidies on agriculture to prevent developing countries from coming in. So even if the licensing proposal were at all feasible within Afghanistan, the international it would require internationally that Australia and France and other countries give up their legal production, which is not going to happen anytime in the foreseeable future. Quick alternative lively projects. I like the term sort of quick tactical victories because I think they fit with this point that they sometimes just don't work. And certainly, you know, the effort to throw in $40 million to each major drug-producing province, which I think the U.S. did several years ago, as DAI and one or two other NGOs. No ability to have a long-term impact. Even the better instruments actually are by no means easy solutions or magic bullets. I mean, interdiction looks very attractive. It's going after the parts of the drug industry which are the biggest threat to Afghanistan's whole agenda, the higher level traffickers and their sponsors. It should be more cost effective rather than destroying the livelihoods of hundreds of thousands of farmers, maybe a few thousand traffickers. You'd achieve pretty much similar short-term results. But it's politically difficult, and there's no sign that either the Afghan government is not doing, but neither is the international community. I mean, they're especially in 2001, 2002 to 2003, part of the easy victory was dealing with former, current, and future drug lords in 2002 to overthrow the Taliban. But that's a different story. One solution that we in the World Bank have been pushing is mainstreaming narcotics in development programs, and this seems like a positive way forward. But you know, just to show I'm unbiased, it's not easy either, and it will take a long time. So does all this mean we can't do anything? No, I wouldn't argue that. And if I'm out of time, then I'm almost off the hook in terms of making some positive suggestions. But I think the reason why narcotics can't be ignored in this whole situation is the strategic integration in Afghanistan. These issues are all related. I mean, the economic development, security, the insurgency, narcotics, governance, and corruption, they're all intermixed. And if you don't deal with the drug part of it, it's going to be very hard to make some of the progress on the other issues. So what? Now let me qualify a little bit what I've said, just with one point. Things could have been worse. Okay, I mean, in some sense, the inability to come together with, say, a very strong and effective aerial spraying program may have actually, you know, things could be worse. And so the idea that it's been an entire failure, well, it's not been in that sense that you know, some of the worst kind of policy mistakes with big effects have so far been avoided. Well, what would be what's really needed is a smarter strategy, and that sounds like a nice term, and somebody once criticized it by calling it management consultant terminology, which I wasn't aware of, but maybe I've become so you know, I'm so used to the terminology that I don't even see it. But the point being that you have a bunch of very blunt, slow, inadequate instruments that maybe by deploying them better and deploying them strategically and keeping in mind that the drug industry is not a static target, it actually reacts dynamically, and you see this sort of as a repeated effort over a longer term, that may be a way to make progress. So one principle I've already alluded to, let's focus on the biggest threat to Afghanistan. That's the larger traffickers and their sponsors, serious interdiction against labs. Now, this point about the justice system was made earlier, and I think that's right. But even if it's almost hopeless to actually prosecute and punish these major traffickers and their sponsors, I think a first and very strong and effective initial step would be to get them out of government positions and also for the international community not to deal with them. Those two steps, I think, would actually be serious, because the odd thing is it's striking and it's understandable, but being in a government position matters to these people. So if you actually take them out of their government position, fire them, in other words. If Karzai could fire them and then not also reappoint them in some other position, this would actually send a, would send a very strong signal and would be taken seriously by them. Fully take into account the adverse side effects. I've already talked about eradication. One needs to factor into how strongly and where you deploy it, the effect on farmers whose fields are eradicated. As I mentioned, keep in mind that this is not a static target. The drug industry, according to anecdotal evidence and research that's been done, had close ties with the former Ministry of Defense. When that was reformed and the Afghan National Army was formed, the locus of drug industry moved into the Ministry of Interior and Police. So there was pretty clearly an effective response by the drug industry to counter narcotics efforts. Another trend which we've seen and was reported in the joint report with UNODC last year was that the misuse of counter narcotics instruments by authorities in order to further their own or allied drug interests, and obviously both interdiction and eradication is very vulnerable to corruption and misuse in implementation. Exploit the synergies across instruments. If you have a targeted eradication with effective development in better off areas, you may achieve some success. And maybe in the past there was a lot of focus on the main drug producing provinces, and what happened, not surprisingly, is something called the balloon effect, that in 2003 opium cultivation in Helmand province was reduced by half, and it sprang up elsewhere. In 2004, even more dramatically, cultivation in Nangarhar province was reduced by 96%, and most of that reduction was made up by increases elsewhere. So, don't focus too much on the main areas. Maybe think about a kind of containment strategy. If you actually started increasing the number of provinces where opium is not cultivated and sustained that, it might contain the problem and make it easier to deal with in the future. And I think the last point I'll make, just as a simple point, is this is all going to take time. Thailand, northern part of Pakistan, Turkey, other areas that have succeeded in getting rid of opium production, it's taken time measured in decades rather than years. And I think it gets to the points made earlier about international support and staying power. But certainly, we should not be expecting a very quick and short-run success against drugs in Afghanistan. It's going to take time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, we're going to hear from Malali Pikar-Volpe, who is the Executive Director of the U.S. Afghanistan Reconstruction Council, which is a nonprofit group founded by Afghan Americans and Americans that seeks to facilitate the participation of local civil society in Afghanistan's reconstruction. She's also worked as the director of the Policy Council on Afghan Women, a coalition of Afghan and American organizations working to increase funding and assistance to Afghan women. So whenever she's ready.
Hi. Thank you. Thank you. Since 2002, I've been asked to make this speech about the status of women in Afghanistan about 3 times now. I think I did it in 2002, 2004, and now in 2007. Every year, I'm hoping that the issues that face Afghan women are going to just get better. But then again comes October, November, and I'm asked to speak on the status of Afghan women. And I find new and more daunting issues emerging without the old ones really having been remedied too much. Sorry. Oh, thank you. So I also want to tell you, as you know, I'm not a scholar, so I will not have any well thought out macro policy recommendations. But I do have them. I mean, I have plenty of them. It's just that they are at the micro level, and I don't think anybody's going to take them seriously because they're actually doable. So, so we'll see. Let's see if I can figure this out. Okay, well, as you all recall, in 2001, we were all shocked to find out about the treatment of Afghan women by the Taliban. And their emancipation after the Taliban actually became the most prominent cause of celebration for international media and Western governments. The international community mandated gender rights as a cross-cutting focus of development strategy for Afghanistan. And also the interim government of Afghanistan made a pledge to prioritize and facilitate women's rights and reintegration into society. And a lot of action was taken at that point. So women had a lot to celebrate initially. The government of Afghanistan created the Ministry of Women's Affairs in 2002 to help remedy the harsh treatment of women under the Taliban. 3 women were appointed as ministers under the interim government in 2002. And subsequently, the Afghan government signed the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women in 2003. Actually, I believe the U.S. hasn't signed that convention yet. Women participated in ratification of a constitution that gave them equal status as citizens, including the right to participate in presidential elections and vote. They were given a 25% quota for election of women to the parliament. And today there are actually 68 women in Afghan parliament out of 249 MPs. That exceeds the quota. Both boys and girls returned to school, and women gained access to higher education, which was denied to them under the Taliban. A year later, organizations started on developing thousands of community development organizations. The CDCs, as they're known, they were formed alongside the traditional shuras that I'm sure everyone has heard of that make local level decisions in thousands of Afghan villages. The CDCs were designed to be more inclusive of underrepresented groups like women and poorer farmers, whereas traditional groups were normally dominated by landowners or religious leaders. Okay. The Afghan National Development Strategy and the Afghan Compact were signed. They provided guidelines for benchmarks for human rights that directly address women's issues. The government of Afghanistan also recently introduced a marriage contract to protect women's human rights. Before now, there were no marriage contracts. They've also proposed legislation to criminalize violence against women, which is now the major issue facing Afghan women. And there's also an ongoing policy for legal reform. Okay, but as we know, ratification is not enforcement, and rhetoric is not always action. So today there's a systematic violation of Afghan women's rights, and it's exacerbated and perpetrated by continuing challenges in security, narcotics trade, government's capacity or lack of, the construction process, lack of access to justice, and lack of education and economic opportunities for women. Insecurity poses the greatest challenge to women's progress because it forces them to stay home, but also corruption on the part of government and resistance to change on the part of the Afghan public are just really formidable challenges to women's progress. On the other hand, little attempt has been made by the government of Afghanistan to herald any kind of social attitude, a change in social attitude towards women's status. The Afghan Research and Evaluation Unit is a research group. They looked into gender and local level decision makings after the establishment of the Community Development Councils, the CDCs. They looked into 30 communities, and they found that there's actually no difference in women's decision-making capability between the old shuras in the new CDCs that were set up by international NGOs and funded by international donors like the USAID. The new SHORAs actually increased the number of women who would work on making decisions for development projects in their own community, which is what the CDCs are supposed to do. But their participation was not really substantive. But the report also found that there's very little local interest in changing the existing power dynamics to correspond with principles of participation for women. In many CDC communities, they did not prioritize women's development projects. But they had instead become very well-versed in telling outsiders what they perceived were correct priorities for the use of development funds. Basically, they just learned to please the foreigners and get access to the development funds. Terrorism has been extremely effective in discouraging international NGOs from fulfilling their promise to Afghan women. Fear of local backlash, which in fact is fear of Taliban, compels large development organizations and contractors to communicate gender goals to recipient communities and to funders, but they don't really enforce them. There's little evidence that the gender staff that work for large international NGOs have the necessary understanding of gender concepts themselves. Even the attitude of many gender workers within these large international NGOs and development organizations were found to be mechanical. They just do the work, and they're number-driven. The UN Human Development Report just recently came out, and I mean, there's some really encouraging statistics there, but there needs to be a lot of work done. GDP per capita increased from $683 in 2002 to $964 in 2005, which also brings me to another point. I heard somebody mention that the portion of GDP from narcotics has not gone up in the national GDP, but actually the amount of income that an individual earns from narcotics is twice that of the income they get from international aid, which makes me think we should consult the drug traders on how to increase income for Afghans. Enrollment ratios in schools, which seemed to be a huge issue when the Taliban left Afghanistan, has risen to 59.3%, up from 45%. And the rate of Afghans dying before their first birthday has fallen to from 165 to 135 per 1,000 live births. And the other really good influence has been that the number of healthcare workers have increased by about 15,000 in 2007. That's a 49% increase, and they result in 40,000 more successful births. But unfortunately, the maternal mortality rate remains among the worst for Afghanistan, remains among the worst in the world. It's fourth from worst in the world. And only 9% of the women in Afghanistan in rural areas have access to professional health care. But I want to tell you a story about a professional health care worker that I met in Takhar last year. She was trained by one of these programs that was heralded as, the revolutionizing program in Afghanistan, and she was illiterate. I met her at her house. She had her cow right outside her door where she was keeping her pots to cook in. And I asked her how she said that she was chosen because there were actually no literate women within her village. And I asked her how she knows what to do. She said, well, she has a color-coded system for knowing which medicines go for which disease. So if anybody ever changes the color of those bottles, somebody's going to die. But I mean, it was just amazing to me so people like that actually count among the educated healthcare workers in Afghanistan. The literacy rate, I think, has actually deteriorated in Afghanistan since 2001. Overall, it's 23.5% for the population and only 12% for women. Only 37% of the school-age children, 6 to 13, are enrolled in primary school. I think there's something about 5 million children in school right now. And overall, in Kabul, 50% of the school-age children have access to primary school, but in rural areas, it's 40%. In the south and southeast, where the Taliban are active, and you just heard about the insurgency as well as drugs, only 9% of the girls actually go to school. In places like Zabul and Uruzgan, which were actually on the map, 1% of the girls, and in Helmand, where narcotics and insurgency is the strongest, 6% of the girls actually just go to school. Number of attacks on teachers in schools rose to 204 in 2005 and 2006. This has resulted in thousands of schools closing. So there are schools now in the south and southeast, and girls are not going to school. And for those who are going to school, the quality of education in Afghanistan remains really poor. The teachers on the average have an 8th grade education, and people go to school for 2 to 3 hours a day because the facilities are scarce, and the teachers have to basically work from 8 to 5, teaching 5 different classes. Women in higher education has really failed to become a priority for donor community or for the Afghan government. And we see the proliferation of really expensive private universities in Kabul now, but they're only accessible to the elite. And entry to public university, which is supposed to be based on this system of taking a test and scoring for your faculty, it's no longer merit-based. It's a system that is based on bribery and who you know in Afghanistan. But the good news is the Ministry of Education has put in place a 12-year education plan that aims for all school-age children to be in school by the year 2015. Okay. The Gender Development Index, which reflects inequalities between men and women in areas of long and healthy life, knowledge, and decent standards of living. For Afghanistan, it's at 0.31%. It reflects notable inequality between men and women. Economic earned income for females is $478, and for males, it's $1,428. And some of the reasons for discrepancy is that in Afghanistan, 80 to 90% of the women work within informal sectors, and they're not compensated for work like in agriculture. There's also a lot of cultural constraints on women's mobility, which means they can't really go outside the house to work. Child and early marriage prevent women from completing their education or getting access to better jobs. And these girls, after they're married, end up having numerous and frequent pregnancies. There are 15,000 widows in Kabul, and they face tons of barriers to employment opportunities or access to basic services, mostly because they don't exist, or to education, and most of them depend on begging to earn a living. Also, extremely low government wages, which I think currently is between $50 to $70, and I don't know how that adds up to this $478. I mean, the actual net average, sorry, it adds up to the $480, but I don't know how they came up with the per capita income because about 70,000 people work for the government, and they earn between $50 to $70. But this really contributes to poverty for women. About 34,000 women work in the public sector. On the other hand, there's the good news on this side is that there's improved access to microfinance for women. MISFA, which is the Micro Investment Support Facility in Afghanistan, reported that 75% of their grantees are women, and the average loan size is about $270. Violence against women is the most recent issue that has emerged in Afghanistan. And it's a major area of concern. The reason we haven't heard so much about it until now is mostly because violence against women was severely underreported in the early years of Karzai. But it's considered one of the most detrimental factors to women's progress, and it affects 87.2% of women in Afghanistan. There was very little research until very recently, and there were massive barriers to to reporting. Violence against women remains, excuse me, underreported due to a lack of infrastructure, but also social stigma and insensitivity to violence against women in Afghanistan. People just don't consider it a crime, and there's very little funding for violence to deal with violence against women. More recently, the issue has received some attention because groups like the Global Rights and UNIFEM made it their responsibility to do some research. And the UNIFEM data was collected through Afghan organizations that work with cases of domestic violence. They collected data from 17 organizations, including the courts, the Ministry of Women's Affairs, the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission, safe houses, and national and international NGOs, and some UN agencies. And as you can see, the UNIFEM study consisted of 1,327 cases, but it was before 2005. Reporting has actually increased since then. 64% of the women who were victimized were married. 32% are between ages 13 to 35. And family members were the most common perpetrators of violence against women. See, the underreporting is accentuated by the fact that a significant percent, 46.3% of the data that was collected was from Kabul, where people are willing to report these things. And about 75% of the victims who reported violence were literate. So you can imagine that the 82% or 88% of the women who are not literate are not reporting violence. 82%, out of the 73% that were of the women who were victimized by their own family, out of that, 82% of them was their intimate partner. But the victims face discrimination, and they face discrimination in the form of violence, and the forms of violence that they face include forced marriages, child marriages, domestic violence, sexual harassment, trafficking, and honor killing, and imprisonment by family to prevent them from moving or leaving the house. Forced marriages represent 60 to 80% of all marriages. And the reason people force their children to get married is because there's a social stigma to having adult unmarried daughters in the house. There's also economic hardship, which forces people to basically sell their daughters bride price, and that's paid to the woman's family. Women are also forced into marriage as a form of alternative dispute resolution, where the tribal councils give the girls as bad, what's known as bad, to the victims, to the family of the victim. So basically, if a person kills another person's son, they get to have their daughter and do whatever they want with her. Also, family honor results in forced marriages of rape victims to perpetrators. This is another form of alternative dispute resolution at the local level. 40% of forced marriages are those of children under 16. Some children are as young as 6. I actually met a woman who told me she was married when she was 8. She was about 29 years old, but she looked much older than me. And she was married to a 70-year-old guy who I think her father owed him money. He died a few years later. She was thrown out of the house and when she was, I don't know, like 14 or 15. And she basically maintained herself through prostitution. And she told me that when I was there, I don't remember exactly where I met her, but she said that it was somewhere in the north. That day, her 13-year-old daughter was getting married, but she wasn't allowed to go to her wedding. Trafficking of women and girls and young boys is rampant in Afghanistan. It's both internally as well as to Iran, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and they're taken for forced marriages, forced labor, and commercial sexual exploitation. What are some of the underlying causes for violence against women? Well, for one, women continue to be prosecuted for zina, which is sex outside marriage, when reporting cases of rape. So I actually heard about a woman in Saudi Arabia today that was also being prosecuted. She was jailed for having been raped by a business associate because they blamed her for having talked to him when she's not allowed to talk. And this is in Saudi Arabia. So I think women in Afghanistan can feel a little bit better knowing they're not the only ones going to jail for being raped. There are corrupted border guards. They're found to facilitate trafficking in women. And there's also evidence of systematic complicity with traffickers among border, highway, and police who just take bribes and let them traffic women and children. The healthcare sector has very little capacity outside of Kabul to respond to patients who experience sexual violence. And they're also insensitive to victims of rape and sexual abuse. Silence, family silence, teacher silence, silence about sexuality really limits prevention efforts. Sexual abuse, assault, and rape are not discussed openly between parents, children, teachers, doctors. It's a social taboo. We don't talk about it. Women in public space. In 2001, there were 3 women ministers. Right now, there's only one. And there's only one single governor out of 32 governors. The women in parliament, it's estimated that 60%, they're constantly threatened, and they're silenced by the other male MPs. And those MPs, most of them, at least 60% of the current members of parliament are warlords or affiliated with warlords, and at least 20 of them retain active private militias. Women's shuras, or the councils that we talked about, that were part of the National Solidarity Program under the Ministry of Rural Development, they rarely take women's decisions into account compared to the traditionally based male shuras, of course. And women who participate in shuras are constantly faced with threats and intimidation. Access to justice is very limited, and discrimination prevails in both the traditional courts and the judicial courts in Afghanistan. 20% of the cases are settled through judicial courts, and 80% are settled through traditional justice. The police are completely insensitive to crimes against women, such as domestic violence and rape, and they will accept bribes to let people go free. And most of them, a majority of them, lack any kind of knowledge about Afghan international laws and respect to women's rights. So out of the estimated 62,000 police in the Afghan National Police, only 233 are women. And these women, I mean, they operate within this patriarchal norm, which excludes them from any kind of decision-making, even there. Most councils, the tribal councils, also exclude women from decision-making, and they are the ones that constantly deal out this bad as any kind of mitigation, where they give a girl for somebody who's lost their land or lost a member of their family or whatever the case may be. There are some mechanisms to meet the needs of, to actually deal with violence against women at some level, but much more needs to be done. There are an estimated 8 to 10 shelters operating in the country. However, funders are systematically denying funding for women's shelters. They just don't believe in providing shelters for women. There's also an increasing commitment from Afghan and international NGOs to finding out more about violence against women. And also, while it's largely unenforced, the Afghan civil law does contain provisions which criminalizes certain acts of violence against women. But it provides the framework necessary to build upon. The Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs and UNICEF have launched a public awareness campaign against the dangers of trafficking. The government of Afghanistan has in place an anti-trafficking task force since 2003. Although we claim that trafficking is not a problem in Afghanistan, the government has arrested tons of people, and they have repatriated 400 children from, Oman, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Zimbabwe. Okay, I'll be done. there's other, there are a few other highlights that I'm out of time, but the government has managed to amass the 2,400 pieces of legislation that date back to the King Zaire Shah's time, and they're looking through it, and hopefully there will be some kind of approach to legal reform in the near future. But my time is up, so I'm going to let you go. There's a few other slides, but I did have recommendations. There's recommendations for the government of Afghanistan and also for donors. And I just want to say this one thing that I think out of all the recommendations, I'd like to urge the donors to actually stop the practice of reverence for outdated and barbaric practices in Afghanistan. These are done under the guise of cultural sensitivity, but they instead just perpetrate the violence and the discrimination against women in Afghanistan. I mean, INGOs should be agents of change, not agents of keeping the same old customs that violate women's rights all the time. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. There are several questions that I could ask, but I'm not, because I want to give you all a chance to ask questions in the time we have left. Very briefly, we're going to have a microphone going around, so please wait for it before you ask your question. And please be brief. And please also identify yourself and give your affiliation. So if I could see hands. Okay. We'll start right over here. Over.
Ken Dillon, Ciencia Press. For you, Mr. Moderator, is it possible to get copies of the slides, or?
Come talk to me afterward. And we can talk about that.
Okay. And I'd like to ask Ms. Volpe if you could give us perhaps 2 illustrations of those ideas that you had that are too good to become true. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I mean, as I said, for one, sorry, I think I've lost my paper. I want to pick the best one. Maybe we should ask another question, and I'll find.
Yeah, why don't we take another question, then we can come back in a second.
Me.
Why don't we go right behind the gentleman who just asked a question?
Hi, I'm Seema Patel from CSIS. It occurs to me after listening to these presentations on a number of different issues that there might be an underlying counterweight to some of the problems that we're seeing, and that would be economic development, job creation. I would like maybe just take a few seconds for each of the speakers to talk about how employment would affect some of the obstacles within counterinsurgency, counter-narcotics, and also for women, and then maybe discuss what solutions or what trends you're seeing within those fields for private sector growth. Thanks.
Does anyone want to take that question? Okay.
I would nominate Bill.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because we've been doing some work on growth, and it clearly, in the long run, is part of the solution. But I think without security, there are going to be limits on what happens. And in Afghanistan, the bulk of the economy has been in the informal sector. And I think without security and what you could call modicum of rule of law, that's going to be the rule for the future. I think job programs can play a short-term role, and even on counter-narcotics or in other areas, but they really need to be part of a longer-term strategy because they become very unsustainable financially if you continue them for very long. I think what the Afghan economy needs to find is future sustainable growth drivers. Now, they do have a jobless growth driver for the future, which is the copper mine, which has just been let out for a major contract this could be a $1 billion a year business. They have some other resources, but unfortunately they're solid mineral resources, not oil and gas. And my very superficial understanding of international experience, A, they don't have many job linkages. B, but that's also true of liquid. B, the solid minerals, for some reason, and even you go to those parts of the U.S., tend to have much worse environmental impacts than oil and gas extraction. And so I do think there are a lot of issues there. But the way forward would be legal crops that in most ways mimic opium. And the other point I forgot to mention on opium, it's very labor intensive. It's the biggest job generator you can imagine in Afghanistan. And there are some other crops which partly mimic that, whether it's almonds or fruit crops, tree crops, etc. And over time, I think those need to generate jobs. That's a start at an answer.
I'll just make a brief comment on that. It's a good question. I think the real question, at least as I see it, is what is motivating, especially locals, to support insurgent groups, right? Because the center of gravity for most all insurgencies, including this Afghan one, is the local population. So what is motivating locals to support in a variety of ways? I think on the economic front, to answer it, it's not easy to get clear answers. I don't think there really are clear answers, but what you can gather from some of the polling that's been done, which has been okay, there have been interviews of detainees from NATO and Afghan forces, and then intelligence reporting. There appear to be a couple of things. I would say the most significant thing that tends to come up is actually security-related issues, where people literally do not feel safe, and without that level of security, it's very difficult to do a lot of the economic reconstruction and development that will become important. So I think that is fundamental. At the same time, in some of the polling, employment does come up as a factor. I think it would certainly not solve the problem without security, but I think what we see on the front lines in the South and the East is that locals may turn in some cases to the Taliban or other groups because they're being paid in some cases 2 or 3 times more than Afghan National Army and especially police forces. So it's just more profitable to fight for one side rather than the other. So I think it would help. I don't think in and of itself it would solve the problem, but I think it would help.
I'd add one brief comment, Stephen. It's an excellent question. Democracies tend to focus on big picture kinds of stuff, and then they worry later about all the engineering details. And I think that's symptomatic of events in Afghanistan and Iraq. And one of my criticisms has been is we need much better high-level supervision of all those different engineering-level details, jobs, the economy, political structures. There needs to be much closer supervision of those kinds of activities to be sure that you're accomplishing what you sought to accomplish in the beginning. But I don't want to. I hate to establish the principle that every speaker responds to every question. So
let's go back to the previous question.
Oh, well, the previous, I'll answer this one. I think jobs is a really important phenomenon. It's interesting for me because I see both sides of development. As someone who's in Washington and goes to these conferences, I hear the macro vision of development, and then as an Afghan, when I go there and I talk to villagers, and I still have family in Afghanistan, there's a huge gap, and Afghans really do want jobs. At the villages when I go, that's what they ask for. They want to know why they don't have jobs, and what if. So it becomes an issue of so what job they want? They constantly ask for production jobs because everything into Afghanistan is imported. From tea to chocolate to dresses to everything is imported. So they just want to know why they cannot make these things for themselves and why nobody's helping them. So that's one of the things that would probably help even narcotics growth, poppy growth and stuff. But another thing with short-term solutions, those, I think, cash for work programs they call, I was actually in Afghanistan and I was in part of Badakhshan where there's tons of poppy. Oh, sorry. And when the Cash for Work program started, they actually took their kids out of school and sent them to work on Poppy, and then they went and took the Cash for Work job themselves. So there was really no difference in taking people out of poppy production. So I think it's an important aspect, and I don't really have the answers in terms of how to start those jobs. But I wanted to just say one thing in terms of recommendations. I feel like the effect or the impact of a lot of these development projects could be really multiplied if the donors started emphasizing downward accountability on the part of contractors and implementers. Because especially towards women, because these agencies tend to really focus their accountability towards donors. And I'm sorry, but that can be really achieved with impeccable report writing and doesn't have to be substantiated. So that's one of my recommendations. And also for the government of Afghanistan, I think I would ask them to strive to eradicate the barbaric and the bogus practice of honor, because it's at the expense of women. And I mean, they can do that through national announcements, organizing campaigns and public education messages against violence and domestic abuse. And they should reflect them on billboards, just like they've had the war against Poppy. Not that that worked, but I think this may actually open their eyes to the fatality of violence against women. And they should just open up and bite the bullet and provide sexual health education and sex abuse and rape prevention workshops in schools using teachers and community leaders. They should stop this practice of, this bogus sort of social stigma about talking anything that has to do with sexuality and women. So those are my 2 recommendations.
Okay, let's see. Let's go in the back there. There was a question, right? Gentleman with the, it's a navy blazer, I guess.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you, everybody on the panel, for so much optimism. And I'm sorry, I was so tempted. No, but I think it was very informative. My question is for Mr. Jones, very specific to counterinsurgency. I was wondering if you could. You talked about the increase in the increase in insurgency and the various counterinsurgency mechanisms being applied by ISAF, the Pakistanis on their own side. If you could maybe talk about a success story over there, where the 2 driving factors that you talked about, lack of governance and externalities, were controlled to some degree, and how influential are some of these command and control centers of Al-Qaeda and several other terrorist organizations in Pakistan vis-a-vis Afghanistan?
Good questions. I got at least 2 of them there on successes and then the border issues. On the successful side, I think one area that has seen some positive changes is there are a couple of areas of the East where the levels of violence appear to have decreased slightly for a few reasons. One is there have been focused efforts by a number of the local PRTs to work at the district and provincial level to improve governance. The level, in this case of U.S. forces, has been decent in the East, at least in some provinces of the East. And outside support, at least in a couple of areas, has been limited through coordination with the Pakistanis. So I think there have been a couple of provinces where levels of violence have decreased somewhat. It's not true across the East, especially as you get up into the Jalalabad area. I think it's become the levels of the metrics of violence, I think, have increased. But there are some areas of the East where I think there have been some successful efforts to decrease levels of violence, and it has mostly been, I would say, governance and issues related to outside support. On the border issues, just so I understand your question, it was what specifically on how significant is the Al Qaeda base? I would say It's significant. I don't want to overstate the al-Qaeda base of operations in the tribal areas. I mean, at least as I see it, it's just sort of two main areas. One is North Waziristan, and two is up into the northern parts of the tribal areas in Bajor, for example. And al-Qaeda, at least as I see it, plays a role that's mostly kind of a force multiplier. There aren't large numbers of I haven't seen good evidence of large numbers of al-Qaeda. We're talking about or other foreigners in Afghanistan. I'm talking about Arabs, Egyptians, Libyans, even Uzbeks. Most of them tend to stay on the Pakistani side of the border. Where they become important is on assistance and recruitment for suicide bombers, help in training, including for improvised explosive devices, getting IED components across the border and put together at safe houses in key Afghan provinces. Information operations using As-Sahab media for the disbursement of video footage and the internet in general is fundamental, and then just help at the operational strategic levels. But I see it as more of a multiplier effect. But I think it's absolutely critical. I think you'd still probably have an insurgency without al-Qaeda, but it would not be at the level it's at, and the groups would not be as tactically competent as they are without them.
Okay, let's pool some questions together because we're really running out of time. So one back there, and then we'll come to this gentleman right here in the gray suit.
Hello, my name is Weinig Marcel. I'm with the Netherlands Embassy. And my government recently decided to extend the Dutch presence in the province of Uruzgan. This is a question for Seth Jones. Because the debate in the parliament has been focused on the reconstruction in the province of Uruzgan and how is it feasible to improve the possibilities of reconstruction rather than fighting all the time. And what do you think are the prospects for the coming 2 or 3 years in the foreseeable future? And a second question, what are your impressions of the cooperation of NATO and aid organizations in the field of reconstruction?
Okay, and sir, you could ask your question.
My name is Barry Eli Riza with Polytrade International Corp. And nobody seemed to have talked about any business encouragement in the country of Afghanistan as far as investments. I would like to know what are we doing as far as encouraging businesses, and especially small businesses, to do business in Afghanistan. I know big businesses can just travel there and they can do their work. And some of the problems that I personally have had as a small business is that any organizations I found is that they usually don't have an email, and if they do have an email, it seems like it's not even working. And if it does work, it seems like nobody's even replying. So what are you guys doing to encourage communication with the business world?
Okay, thanks.
Good question, and I was glad to see the Dutch committed now. That I think and I hope means the Canadians now will be committed. So I know the Canadians were carefully monitoring the Dutch debate. On the prospects, at least on the area around Uruzgan, I mean, one of the problems the Dutch, at least in my view, face is that band that goes from, say, northern Helmand, Sangin, Musakala, up through northern Kandahar, including now Arghandab, up into Uruzgan, is obviously has an important impact on the Dutch. So other provinces and Taliban and allied groups operating in other provinces that move through Uruzgan clearly has an impact on anything the Dutch have to face. So the point is that what the British are doing and the Canadians are doing and the U.S. is doing in other areas will and is having an important impact on anything the Dutch do or have to do. That means coordination and cooperation will be fundamental and critical. I think the approach where it's done well has also included what we call a clear, hold, and build. I mean, there will be, because of the area Uruzgan is in, a need to clear territory that's been penetrated by bad people. it needs to be held. There have been insufficient forces in a lot of areas, including local Afghan forces, to hold. But there needs to be, I think, effort to hold that territory, and then that's where your reconstruction efforts come in, not really in a tactical way, but also to focus key resources, I think, that are addressing, as we heard earlier, local population needs and desires. So it's a combination of clearing, holding, building that I think will be fundamental. But again, what the Dutch face, though, will be impacted by things that go on in other provinces. On NATO and aid organizations, I mean, this has been abysmal on the NATO on the Afghan front since 2001. One thing we never got right in Afghanistan is coordination, let alone within NATO, among the states, international organizations, and non-governmental organizations. It was not done the way Bosnia, Kosovo, even Iraq was done, where you had some command and control arrangements. I think there has been some discussion within various governments about improving civilian command and control arrangements, at least with major Western countries. I think that would be helpful. You could actually talk with, if not one voice, more of an efficient voice to non-governmental organizations. I think there's an argument along those lines.
Okay, why don't we wrap up with business opportunities? Do you want to address that?
Okay, no, certainly a very important question, and from what I'm aware of experience in many of these post-conflict or conflict-affected situations, the private sector gets neglected, and I think it's a sort of chronic pattern that we've seen, and Afghanistan is no exception. I think you're very right to talk about small and medium-sized enterprises. I mean, on one side, the biggest success story you could point to is telecoms, were very successful in attracting, I think, about $800 million of foreign investment, by far the biggest area. That's rather special. The copper mining or other mining will also be that way, because these kind of big companies go into the most difficult areas and are successful. You know, the surveys that have been done of businesses, including one by the World Bank and IFC, suggest that businesses chronically rate 4 issues. One is electricity, one is access to land, one is access to finance, and the fourth one is the issue of corruption. And I think those are areas where there's a need to provide support. So some of it is like this general policy environment. Then I think another area is the business support services, especially for these smaller companies. And a third one, which is, I mean, it's actually criminal in my view that the international community, the military forces, and the civilian aid is spending so little in Afghanistan. I mean, this is also, again, typical of peacekeeping forces. I think there was a study which suggested only between 4 and 9% of international peacekeeping forces spending is actually in the country concerned. Afghanistan is no exception. There are efforts being made now. I mean, you could by local procurement. I mean, somebody talked about drugs being more important than aid in terms of total income. That's certainly true. But, you know, the international military forces are spending quite a lot of money, and it's not in Afghanistan mostly. The U.S. is actually doing better than most and beginning to really pursue local procurement. I think this would, and then it would support business development if it's done properly and transparently. It's not like procuring security guards from the local warlord. No, I mean, you've got to do a fairly transparent and open process with a lot of support to local business development. This could inject $1 billion a year into the Afghan economy. I think it's a grossly neglected area.
I can just address your immediate concern. I mean, the Afghan government has done a great deal of research and work in terms of getting businesses into Afghanistan. There's a Afghan-American Chamber of Commerce in McLean, Virginia, that you could contact if you're interested in finding out opportunities. There's an Afghan International Chamber of Commerce in Dubai and also in Canada. There's the Afghan Investment Support Agency in Kabul, and so apparently the World Bank, I thought it was, said that it was the easiest place to get your business license. You can actually get your business license within a day. Once you get that, then I can't guarantee that you're going to get anywhere, because getting access to land and finding place to rent. I mean, there's actually it's a great market. I mean, it's an emerging market, and there's the risk-reward issue comes into place. The risks are high, but the rewards are tremendous too. Even though, you know, the ISAF may not be spending their money, there's tons of money in Afghanistan. And if you don't mind taking, you know, a piece of the economy, whether it comes from drugs or other places, doesn't matter. If you're a legitimate business, there's tons of money in Afghanistan. And people are becoming wealthy by the day. So I think businesses that have taken the chance to make the investment have reaped the rewards. And labor is cheap. Once you can get past through the obstacles, there is a way to do business in Afghanistan. A lot of people